Hello. Hi, Lisa.
Hi.
Welcome, everyone, to the Culture Connection Speaker Series. I'm Michael Beckelheimer in Washington, D.C., and I'm talking with American professors of Russian studies about their insights into Russian culture and how they teach it at American colleges and universities. This program is presented by the American Center of Moscow, which is supported by the American Embassy in Moscow. If you're watching on the American Center's YouTube, contact or Telegram channels, please post your comments and questions at any time. For Russian subtitles, you can select closed captioning in Russian. So today we're talking to Lisa Kirschenbaum, a professor of history at West Chester University in the state of Pennsylvania. She teaches courses on Russian history, modern Russia, world communism, World War II, and women and the Holocaust, among other topics. She has written books about the siege of Leningrad, childhood in Soviet Russia, and international communism in the Spanish Civil War. So you see, we could spend days talking to Professor Kirschenbaum about many things, but today we're mainly going to talk to her about her research on Ilf and Petrov and their famous road trip across America. So Professor Lisa Kirschenbaum, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here and to have a chance to talk about Ilf and Petrov's amazing road trip.
It is. It's a great story we all love. We're going to start with a very easy question so we get to know you a little bit. How did you become interested in Russian, and when was the first time you went to Russia?
I became interested in Russia in the 1980s when I was in high school. It was obviously a very important moment in the Cold War and seemed important to know something about Russia. And I also got really interested in Russian literature when I was in high school. So when I went to college, I decided to study Russian history and also Russian language. I went to the Soviet Union for the first time at a very exciting moment in the summer of 1991 to do my dissertation research. And I was there in August 1991 during the attempted coup against Gorbachev. So it was a very exciting introduction to Russian history in the present.
I'm so easily distracted. It must be very difficult to work on your dissertation research while this is happening in Moscow.
Yeah, that was the last week that I was there, and I did not visit the archive or the library in that last week.
What was your dissertation about?
My dissertation looked at family and childhood in the years between 1917 and about 1932. I was really interested in the ways in which the Soviet state wanted to revolutionize childhood, how children were brought up, and how families had or didn't have a responsibility for children.
On that topic, was there a noticeable connection between the Russian childhood experience and how any of that influenced the Soviet experience? Because the loose theme of this speaker series is how Russian culture, how it looked when it emerged into the Soviet Union.
Well, it's a really interesting question to look at with regard to childhood, because in the early years, there really was an effort to do things in completely new ways. So there was an emphasis on much more child-centered schools. They were going to get rid of things like homework and tests. A lot of discipline in the schools they wanted to get rid of. This didn't last for too long. By the 1930s, of course, traditional subjects, tests, and homework are returning, as is a lot of the traditional curriculum, more of an emphasis on, say, the Russian classics in literature. But at that revolutionary moment in the 1920s, there really was an effort to break with some of those Russian traditions, and it ended up being very, very difficult to do.
Right. I imagine there was a short period where they probably weren't forcing children to recite Pushkin.
Right. And in fact, they didn't want to force children to do anything. These really child-centered programs emphasized that children had to be given kind of free rein to develop their own creativity.
Mm-hmm. So progressive. But then I guess they learned too much free rein.
Well, it came into conflict both with extreme material shortages. They didn't have the funds to do what they wanted to do, and also came into conflict with the industrialization drive and the idea that we needed to train skilled workers and not, let kids figure out what they wanted to do on their own.
Right. So in your biography on the website for your university, and you've, in a really beautiful way, you've talked about how you are interested in exploring how people come to represent and understand their own life stories as part of history, focusing on the connections between individual private lives and the momentous traumatic events of Russia's 20th century. I'm sure our Russian audience is probably tired of me talking about momentous, tragic events in Russia, but it's a common thread. And I love that you're looking at people's stories. And in fact, today we're looking at Ilf and Petrov and their stories and the stories of the people they meet. And you bring this to life in your research on the siege of Leningrad. Can you tell us a little bit about people and how they saw their own life stories as part of this bigger scope of Russian history?
Yeah, it's a theme that a lot of my research has been on very different topics, but it's a theme that I think ties it all together. One really, I think, moving example from my work on the siege of Leningrad is a group of librarians at the State Public Library who, like everybody in the city, were, of course, suffering tremendously during the first blockade winter. And they decided that they were going to kind of deal with this by starting a collection at the library of everything that was published about Leningrad during the blockade. So they started sort of memorializing it even while it was going on. And they, of course, knew the realities of the blockade. They were living through it. And yet a way that they kind of had something important to do and gave their own suffering some larger meaning was by embedding it in this larger, what everybody took to be a very historic event, this unbelievable kind of experience that the entire city, indeed the entire country, but they're really focused on Leningrad, was going through. So it's a really interesting way in which they're collecting things that we might say are propaganda, that anybody living through the blockade could know that's not really the full story. And yet it was important for them to collect it and to be part of that story whose limits they knew, but that was also was important to them, gave some meaning to what they were going through.
You know, it seems like we have access to a lot of such diaries and memories of that period that were recorded. Was there this group at the library was collecting this information? Were they encouraging people to record their lives or keep diaries, or did it just happen?
The librarians, as far as I know, were not interested in encouraging people to write diaries, but there were other organizations in Leningrad that were, and there were exhibitions about the blockade that were staged in Leningrad even before it closed. So there were lots of organizations and individuals in the city who were making a concerted effort to kind of write down this history as it was happening. And there was a real surge in people writing diaries during the blockade for exactly that reason, that they wanted to record what they were going through, but they also wanted to record a moment in history.
That's interesting. So we're going to make a very unnatural transition from the blockade to Ilf and Petrov. And I've asked the team to put your slides up. So when did you first discover these two writers?
Well, I've known about them for a long time. They're, for me, like for a lot of people, they're favorite Soviet writers. But I learned, I'm not sure when I learned about their trip to America, but I'd also known about that for a long time. And it really wasn't until I started thinking about connections between immigrants from the Russian Empire and people in the Soviet Union that I kind of looked more seriously at the idea of tracing their trip. But I'd known and loved them for a long time.
Because I think first you said you first read the 12 Chairs.
Yeah, like
Was
a
that
lot
part
of
of your
people.
college curriculum? Did you read that in school? Or?
I didn't read it for a class, and I think I saw a theatrical adaptation of it, and then I read it. So it's, it's an important work. So at some point, I was very interested in Russian literature, and at some point I read it in English.
Right.
Was the first time.
Exactly. Who were Ilf and Petrov? Who were they before the revolution? And then what changed when they moved to Moscow and became Soviet writers?
They were both from the city of Odessa. Petrov was a little bit younger. They wrote a joint autobiography in which they talked about how the two parts were born in different years. And they both were writers in Odessa. And then in the 1920s, they moved separately to Moscow, which is kind of where if one were an ambitious writer, one would want to go perhaps to make their way. And Petrov's older brother was already an established writer, Valentin Kitaev. He adopted the pen name Petrov to separate himself a little bit from his brother. They both ended up working at the same journal in Moscow with a lot of people who became very important Soviet writers like Mikhail Bulgakov and Isaac Babel and Valentin Kitaev. And it's Kitaev who takes credit for giving them the idea of working as a team, and also gave them the story of the 12 chairs and set them to work writing it, which they did working as a team. They literally wrote every sentence together, and they finished it rather quickly. And Kitaev was really happy with what they did. And that was the start of their partnership.
I can't imagine two people writing sentences simultaneously.
I know, but they that's, I think, what kind of made them original. They always said if they both came up with the same idea, then they knew that they had to think of something else that was too obvious.
In your research about them, did you learn anything about them as people, as individuals, that surprised you? Or
I don't know that anything that surprised me. They seem like they have very different personalities. I think Ilf was a lot more reserved and kind of a lot more sardonic and pessimistic. And Petrov, I think, is the more lighthearted one. And they just seem to really complement each other very well.
So today we're going to talk a bit about your book, which I guess it was inspired by Ilf and Petrov, Soviet Adventures in the Land of the Capitalists. Can you tell us a little bit about this book? Give us a quick summary.
It retraces their American road trip, which they took in 1935, which probably most Russian listeners are familiar with. They came to the United States, bought a new Ford, and took a 10,000-mile road trip from New York to California and back. And they published their travelogue. And what I wanted to do was sort of find the American side of the story. They had left some things out. They misidentified people or didn't identify people in the published work. And I thought, well, what could we learn about how cultural connections happen or don't happen if I could kind of uncover the American side of the story? So in part, I actually literally retraced their road trip to see where they went. And I went to libraries and archives along the way to try and find the traces of the people they met from the American side.
There's a theme that comes out in the book, and I think it must be connected to one of the things you've told me before, which is how you had been doing research on international communism during the Spanish Civil War, and you noticed that many of the you met many Russians who had emigrated from the U.S. back to their Soviet homeland, but had never really been there before, so they weren't re-emigrating. So in your book, there are these questions of what does it mean to be Russian, or when does a Russian become an American, and how do you re-emigrate to a country you never even lived in? Can you talk a bit about that theme? Oh, and also the fact that many of the people you interacted with were Jewish Russians and or Jewish, and there was just this whole question about the identity of the people in their story.
Yeah, it was one of the things that really fascinated me, these sort of in-between identities. When I was studying international communism, I kept coming across immigrants from the Russian Empire, mostly Jews, who had come to the United States, in the early 20th century, often long before 1917, who then decided in the early 1930s to go back to the Soviet Union. But to return isn't really what they did, because a lot of them came from places that in the interwar period were not part of the Soviet Union, were maybe part of Poland. So, but they still kind of associated themselves with the Soviet project. So I got really interested in the question of what was going on in these immigrant communities to keep these people who had emigrated from the Russian Empire, often were doing very well in the United States, and yet they remained connected to and felt they were a part of somehow the Soviet Union, where they had never been, and then in a lot of cases went back. So I thought following Ilf and Petrov, who relied on these immigrants, would give me access to these communities, and I could see how the immigrants remained connected to the Soviet Union, where they had never been. And
when you started researching their trip, did you already know that they relied so heavily on immigrants from Russia?
I knew it in a general way. So there's been a lot of work by literary historians on Ilf and Petrov and on this trip. And so I knew, for example, that their guides were, in fact, in one case, a Russian immigrant, and the other, the daughter of Russian immigrants who spoke Russian. So I knew that, and I knew that in a general way they relied on immigrants. But I was really surprised to find out the extent of that across the country once I started uncovering all of the places that they stopped.
Right. It's even more than we thought. I remember when I first read their book a long time ago. Of course, I loved it, but I remember thinking, this isn't fair. They're traveling with Russian-speaking people. They need to be more immersed. But can you talk a little about your sources for the book? You say you went to all of the stops along the way. What were some of the key sources, people or things?
So, well, my first stop, kind of like their first stop, was the State Department. So their first stop would have been getting a visa while they were still in Moscow. So I looked for and was fortunate to find the transcript of their visa interviews, which you're seeing there. And they asked, sort of the standard questions that they asked of anybody who was seeking a non-immigrant visa to the United States. So that gave me their personal answers. And then I uncovered a lot of these visa interviews. So it gave me a sense of who from the Soviet Union was trying to come to the United States, what the US was concerned about in deciding whether or not to give them a visa. And then I looked at a lot of personal papers from people that they met, people like the film director Ruben Mamoulian, Louis Milestone, another director in, and also you're seeing there some a postcard, some of the correspondence that they sent home during their trip. This is the inscription that they made in Ruben Mamoulian's autograph book when they visited him at what they call his bungalow in Beverly Hills in December of 1935. And they actually make a joke here that they make in almost the same way in the book about how they came to Hollywood and stayed on Hollywood Boulevard in the Hotel Hollywood. And in the book, they say, what could be more Hollywoody? And here they just say, what more can you ask of humble around the world travelers? So they're already thinking about how they're going to tell the story while they're there, which I think is fun to notice, that they're already making the jokes that you're going to read in the book. And it gives you a sense, I think, of a very friendly and relaxed meeting people like Mamoulian, I think, would have been great contacts for them because he had emigrated from Soviet Armenia in 1923. He spoke Russian, so there was an ability to meet with someone whose work they respected and to have a conversation in Russia. They didn't need their translators in that case.
Speaking of contacts, I think one of the things that is so fascinating about your story, about their story, is all of the letters of introduction that they had, and all of the contacts, and just all of the creative people around them that helped them prepare their trip, and then made their trip a reality here in the United States. And then even to the point where there was a reception for all of the many people for whom they had letters of introduction, which inspired Bulgakov's ball in hell in Master and Margarita. And I guess, were they friends? I know they worked for the same.
They were friends. They were friends, and I love that their description of that ball is one of the inspirations for Bulgakov, along with a reception that was actually held at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. So they have this really wonderful description of all of these sort of spirits conjured by all of these letters that they brought with them. But it's truly remarkable, the range of people that helped them and that they met.
So what did this look like in the Soviet Union in 1935? Were they just saying, hey, we're going to go to America, tell us who you know? I mean, how did they get so many letters of introduction? And what was the anticipation on the Russian side of their trip?
Well, it seems clear that the foreign ministry wanted them to go. So the American ambassador actually advocates that the State Department give them a visa, which initially they're denied, like a lot of Soviet visitors, as being inadmissible because they have ties to the Communist Party. And the ambassador says, no, the Soviet Foreign Ministry really wants them to come, and it offers us some benefit if they come and write somewhat nice things about the United States. So it's clearly an officially sanctioned trip. It's very unusual for Soviet writers to get an opportunity like this. So it was a privilege, and it was something that the higher-ups wanted them to do. The US and the Soviet Union had normalized relations only in 1933, and it seems clear that they're being sent as cultural ambassadors. They're well known in the United States. Both The 12 Chairs and Little Golden Calf had been translated into English. They were coming, it was perfect cultural ambassadors, not political people, but funny writers, right? The perfect way to kind of smooth friendly relations. And then they got all kinds of letters, both from American journalists who were working in Moscow, like Louis Fisher, and for Soviet cultural figures that they knew who had already been to the United States. People like Sergei Eisenstein, the filmmaker, apparently wrote a lot of letters for them. I only found one of them in Mamoulian's archive. Eisenstein wrote a letter of introduction in English, actually, to Mamoulian, who he had met and he knew spoke Russian, but the letter of introduction is written in English, which I thought was very interesting.
Were there, really thankful that you wrote this book about Ilf and Petrov, but other famous Russian or people from the area, from the empire, had traveled to the United States. Gorky, Mayakovsky. Did you look at their journeys as a reference? And did you ever think maybe you could tell this story with someone else's adventure?
It's a great question. I did look at those other trips, and they're a point of reference for me. They were also a point of reference for Ilf and Petrov, who would have known those travelogues. And a lot of those travelogues use the same kinds of sort of metaphors and tropes in telling the story of a trip to the United States. They all go back to Gorky and tell about a trip to the United States as a descent into hell. And there's a lot of sort of hellish imagery in all of these books, including Ilf and Petrov's. So it's clearly a point of reference for them. And I looked at those stories as well. But I didn't really want to recount any of those trips, in part because Ilf and Petrov's is a lot more fun. It's more extensive, but they also had a much lighter touch in telling about it. They were much less interested in making an ideological point than, say, Boris Pilniak was, and more interested in communicating what was interesting and silly and absurd and bad about the people that they met, but also what was good about the people that they met. They just seemed much more open to the experience than some of the other Soviet travelers.
Can we quickly go back to hell for 1 second? Let's talk about how did Gorky and Mayakovsky and Pilniak describe this American hell? What were the key features that they wrote about?
Key features are pretty much what you would imagine: the vast inequality of rich and poor, and racism, which becomes a really important piece of Soviet understandings of the United States. It's a fundamentally violently racist society. So both of those are key pieces of the hellish aspects of the country. And both of those are things that, of course, that Ilf and Petrov also note.
Right. Considering the environment in Moscow in 1935, I think their work was published in 36, 37. What was the mood in Russia for a lighthearted, positive vision of the American hell?
It really is hard to believe that this book was published in 1937 at the height of the terror, because it definitely describes those hellish aspects of the United States, but it also describes a lot of heavenly things about it, from the roads to the efficiency, to the availability and abundance of food. They say everywhere they go, they're eating steaks. And they say, well, we had a steak here, we had a steak there. And then they'll say, oh, but it tasted really bad. But I'm thinking, in people reading about this in the Soviet Union in the 1930s are just hearing, we ate a lot of steak in the United States. So all of these positive things, and it's really hard to believe in a way that it gets published in 1937 at this incredibly xenophobic moment in the purges, but it does. And why that is, I think is sort of hard to know, partly because it had been sort of commissioned earlier. Part of it was published while they were actually on the trip. They published the photo essay in 1936, so it was sort of already out there. And the reviewers often say they're sort of too positive, and they're too taken in by American efficiency, that this is just a way to sell more stuff, and they don't seem to appreciate that this is not really anything that fabulous. But it's a very positive spin in a lot of ways.
But isn't that counter to the Americanism, idea that America is efficient and can produce things, and they want to emulate that efficiency and that productivity? Like, that is one of the reasons they were sent there in the first place.
Absolutely. And it just seems a little strange to be emphasizing that, I guess, in 1937, but it is absolutely a long history of looking to the United States as a technical model. And that's a lot of what they're doing. But they also have some sort of positive things to say about American democracy, not in the sense of how the government is run, but democracy in the sense of the egalitarian relations between people. They like the fact that Henry Ford and his employees are on a first name basis. They think that's like a really nice thing. Even though Ford obviously has a lot more power than his employees, they like that kind of democracy. So they're definitely in line with that sense of we have a lot to learn technically from the United States. It just seems like maybe not the most opportune moment to stress that is 1937.
Of course, right. I wanted to ask you about some of your inspiration. When I read the title of your book, Adventures in the Land of the Capitalists, I immediately think of Mr. West and the Land of the Bolsheviks, and other references in Russian culture. What were some of those reference points for you when thinking about how to construct this story and how to pull out these details of their experience in America and what it meant for Americans and Russians at that time?
Well, the Mr. West in the Land of the Bolsheviks is definitely one of the inspirations, and I liked that a lot because although obviously it's telling the reverse story, it's very optimistic about the idea that people can learn from one another and change their minds. Mr. West ends up, lauding the land of the Bolsheviks when he learns what it's really about. Of course, Ilf and Petrov can't do that in the same way, but I think that sense that there was a real cultural exchange that happened and they were genuinely trying to understand the people that they met, is something that film does. And that was kind of an inspiration and a different take on that cross-cultural understanding than something like Pilnyak or Mayakovsky's travelogue, which goes to the United States expecting to find hell, finds what they expect, and then says they discovered America.
Mm-hmm.
It's a much less sort of effort to have a real cross-cultural exchange. And I think that Ilf and Petrov are interested in really meeting all different kinds of people and listening to what they have to say. So I was interested in how that fit into these maybe two different kinds of imagined connections between the US and the Soviet Union.
What were some of their exploits or their adventures that you find most entertaining? Because we do think that there's so many humorous moments along this trip. What stands out for you?
I think one of the most interesting sections of it, and I think one of the parts of the trip that they enjoyed the most was in the desert Southwest, where they really wanted to find cowboys and Indians, that they really came with their sort of childhood reading about the Old West. And they were really interested in finding sort of cowboys and Indians that fit their romanticized picture of what the American West was like. And they have a wonderful section in the book where they meet with a Native American, Agapito Pino, and in San Ildefonso, and they present him in the book as sort of very naive. Oh, he doesn't know anything about life beyond the reservation, and he's only has a vague rumor that there's a city called New York. But when you investigate this guy, that's clearly, and the place where they are, it's clearly not the case. So it was a fun opportunity to figure out, did they get the joke that he was pretending to be very naive, basically in order to toy with them? Or did they really think that this was a very, sheltered Native American who had no idea about the modern world? But their interactions in the desert Southwest, I think, are interesting because they have all of these romantic ideas about what they want to find there.
The idea of an American road trip is something that, we hold very dear, and it's very mythic. How did they feel when they were out on the road and that they were looking for real Americans? Did they sense the sort of the scale of the cross country trip and all of these people they were going to meet?
I'm not sure if they really appreciated at the outset what they were getting themselves in for, but the range of people that they met was just incredible. And they, at some point, had to be kind of amazed that they had seen so much of the United States. I think it was more, I think they in some ways took on more than they really anticipated. It was an exhausting trip. They had to do it in 2 months because that's all their guides would give them. And it was a huge undertaking. I don't think they realized quite how big when they left.
Why was this Native American toying with them or
I
making it difficult? What was his
he's
agenda?
he was what in Pueblo society is a real office. He was sort of a Pueblo clown, and he was, I think, as anybody whose hometown maybe becomes a site for tourists, he was having a little fun with the tourists who came looking for innocent Indians who didn't know anything about the outside world. And he thought, oh, I'll give them what they're looking for, even though it was just not true. And a lot of anthropologists who worked in the Pueblo communities in that area at the same time knew him as sort of an inveterate liar and jokester. So you wonder, they're sort of jokesters. Didn't they get that they were, he was pulling their leg, or did they not get that he was pulling their leg?
Well, one of the questions that came up for me as I was reading your book is how much did they, one of the things you set out to do is find out what they left out, right? Like how they presented their findings. And so how much of this was truly what they felt and how much of it was written so that it would be better received by a Soviet audience?
Well, it's so interesting what they say and they don't say. Like, a lot of the people that they meet are in the book, but they're not 100% clear, for example, that all of these people are immigrants. So they're guides who, Mr. and Mrs. Trone, who had roots in the Russian Empire, become the all-American Mr. and Mrs. Adams with no roots in the Russian Empire, although they speak Russian. Likewise, the directors like Mamoulian and Milestone show up in the book, are named, there are pictures of them in the photo essay, but they neglect to say that both of them spoke Russian and were from the Russian Empire. So they leave out a lot of things like that. They, as I had in the visa interview excerpt, they lie to the State Department. Ilf lies and says, I don't have any relatives in the United States, but most of his father's family lived in Hartford, Connecticut. He said, oh no, I don't have any relatives in the United States. Then they went to visit the relatives. So he writes about this in his letters home and his notebook, but the relatives don't show up in the book. So some of it was people who show up in the letters or in the notebook, but not in the book. I was able to figure out who they were and sort of add them into the story. But they don't really, I feel like they're pretty true to the facts. They change some of the timeline, they change some of the identifications, but a lot of the sort of fundamental pieces of the story, they present pretty similarly in their correspondence and notes versus the published work.
Has there been a lot of research or any significant, do you know if there's any significant research or analysis of this, of their trip and their story in Russia? Like, did you have Russian sources? Did you have any collaborators?
Yeah, there's of course the book is very well known in Russia, and in Russia, as in other places, especially literary historians have written a lot about it. So there's a lot of work by people interested in the book as literature. What is less common is for someone to go and say, well, who did they really meet? Can we find out who these Americans were? A lot of people had identified the Trones. That's a basic one. But then some of these other people that they met on the trip, no one had really investigated who they were, where they came from, because most of the work on Ilf and Petrov, unsurprisingly, is about them as literary figures.
Another thing that you bring out in the book that they may have not portrayed 100% accurately is their experiences with American culture. High culture versus low, vulgar culture. Can you talk a little bit about that? What did they do? What cultural activities did they do? What did they
They
experience?
they saw a lot of movies. According to their own accounting, they saw movies almost every night that they were in the United States. So an unbelievable number of, unbelievable, a huge number, but actually a doable number of movies that they saw. So they were very interested in sort of American popular culture, which for them, in a lot of ways, was the movies. They also, especially in New York, took in a lot of high culture. They went to hear Rachmaninoff. They heard the Philadelphia Symphony. Um, they went to they went to Broadway plays. They went to art exhibits. A lot of that stuff, some of that stuff shows up in the book, but largely to emphasize that high culture in the United States is expensive, it's exclusive, it doesn't admit the ordinary people the way in which high culture in the Soviet Union does. What they leave out is what I might call middle culture or the middle brow, culture that actually had a lot in common with Soviet culture, culture that was meant to uplift the masses. So not sort of traditional high culture, not mass culture like the movies, but things like Porgy and Bess or a Van Gogh exhibit at the art museum, culture that was meant to reach a mass audience, but not in a vulgar way, but in a way that sort of was uplifting or enlightening. And they leave a lot of that out. So you get the sense that there's this dichotomy in the US between high culture, which is largely the preserve only of the wealthy, and then this stupefying mass culture, which is designed to just keep the masses docile.
Mhm. And do we know how they really felt about that?
Well, really felt is hard to know. They clearly loved, I mean, they say, oh, we saw lots and lots of bad movies, but sort of like eating lots and lots of bad steaks, they kept going. So there must have been something there that attracted them besides just, thoroughness. They keep eating bad steaks and visiting bad movies, and you start thinking, well, maybe it wasn't as bad as all that, as they keep doing this. And I think they're really interested, for example, when they see Porgy and Bess, which they don't write about in the published work, but they're very interested in the degree to which this American piece of art is actually the work of a large number of immigrants. And again, especially immigrants from the Russian Empire. So they're very interested in a way that they don't write about, with how American art is often created by people who are American, but sort of hyphenated Americans, immigrant Americans, African Americans, people who come from all different kinds of backgrounds.
Right. And so many, Russians,
Right.
obviously, Rachmaninoff, that the high culture is rich Americans listening to Russian composers. So, where do you think they had the most impact, or where do they make the most impressions as they were traveling across the United States?
I think they probably had their biggest impact on people that they could converse with directly. So people who had Russian, who spoke Russian.
Mm-hmm.
And one place where that's clear is in Hollywood, actually,
Mm-hmm.
where both Louis Milestone and Ruben Mamoulian seem to really spend a lot of time with them. Milestone commissions from them a treatment for the 12 chairs, pays them $600 for it. There they seem to be not just observing American culture, but actually trying to get involved in it, to participate in it, and of course also to make a buck.
Mm-hmm.
In other places, they meet lots of interesting people, but often you feel like the connection isn't quite made. In New Mexico, they meet the poet Witter Bynner, who's introduced to them by the novelist John Dos Passos, gives them a letter of introduction. And Biner is a fascinating figure who had perpetuated this literary hoax at around the time of the First World War, and was really had this sly sense of humor that I think they would have truly appreciated. But they never really talked to him about anything except, where should we go to meet Indians? So they kind of missed some opportunities like that.
Mm-hmm. And what did they actually do with the 12 chairs treatment? So back in Hollywood, what was their contribution, and what came of that?
Well, sadly, I was unable to find the treatment in Milestone's papers, so I leave it to some some enterprising person. Maybe they're in their archive in Moscow. But they basically wanted to, they didn't have time to write a screenplay, so they wrote sort of a 23-page treatment for it, which they sold. And Milestone said, "Oh, if I can sell a screenplay on this, you'll get some additional money." But they really wanted to, like a lot of visiting Soviet cultural figures, to kind of make movies in Hollywood or write for the movies in Hollywood. And it just didn't work out. That nothing ever became of that treatment. Milestone was sort of in between pictures at the time they came, and maybe was legitimately interested in doing it, but he ended up doing something totally different for his next picture. And I found no evidence that he ever followed up.
Well, that is the American experience. You go to Hollywood to become famous and succeed, and it's all, it all goes down the drain.
Right. Nothing is more Hollywoody than trying to sell a screenplay.
Right. They wanted to write a movie and they failed.
Yeah. But they were, they did write movies in the Soviet Union, so it wasn't completely far-fetched.
Right. No, exactly. What were Americans asking them about the Soviet Union?
Well, it's so funny because a lot of times they complain that Americans don't ask them anything. For them, this is one of their knocks on Americans, is they're not curious. They don't ask us any questions. We pick up a hitchhiker. We're all speaking Russian in the car, asking the hitchhiker a million questions, and he doesn't ask us anything. He doesn't want to know where we're from. He's not interested in the language that we're talking. And they see this as a great American failing. To me, it's not so surprising. This is a guy whose story they tell, whose wife had been paralyzed by an accident, who was out of work, who didn't have money to pay her medical bills, and was going out, I think, to Arizona, where he had a lead about getting some work. So that he's not super interested in who these Russians are is maybe not surprising. He's got bigger problems on his mind. But they're always complaining that Americans don't ask us anything, that they are not interested, they are not curious.
That's okay. So I agree. The hitchhiker probably was more concerned, but that's a fair point. I think that sometimes Americans are not curious enough and don't ask enough questions. Speaking of that, let's talk about your students. Do you teach Ilf Petrov to students at your university?
I have not really, because it's just the classes that I was teaching at the time that I was working on this project sort of didn't really lend itself to it. But I know that a lot of people do use excerpts from One Story America to talk about Soviet-American relations. And I think it's a really fun way to do it, because they're critical of the United States, but they can also offer some kind of indirect criticism of the Soviet Union.
I'm going to pull up this image from Ogonyok that you supplied. So help me understand, they were sending travelogues, or they wrote travelogues after they returned to the Soviet Union, then it became a book?
So they wrote some articles. They were traveling as reporters for Pravda, and they wrote some things that were published while they were still in the United States. They came back and they create this serialized photo essay that runs in Ogonyok I think it's 7 or 8 episodes. I can't remember now. It's over several issues that feature Ilf's photographs and their jointly written text. And then what becomes One Story America is also serialized, and then in sort of the middle of 1937 is published as a book. So a lot of things are published kind of over time. Some chapters of the book are serialized or published in various places. The photo essay is the only one that includes images, though. The book, as it's finally published, does not. And there's some question of maybe it was supposed to, and it didn't, either because of the cost or because Ilf's photographs were criticized by professional photographers as not being very interesting. So the photo essay is the only place that the photos show up.
Can we talk about Ilf's photographs? Because you talk about it in your book, that this is an art form that he was familiar with and he was, very happy to work with. And there was criticism, but there's an argument that the way he approached his visual subjects was perfect for this type of work.
I think it really was. You can even get a sense just from the 2 photographs you're seeing here. They're not very interesting photographs. And I think they're really doing a couple of things here, though. One is to allow people to look at the United States kind of without any preconceived idea, right? The photographer Alexander Rodchenko said that they weren't photographs, they were bookkeeping, that they were just sort of very straightforward sort of memory aids. But I think that's what they were after in large part, that they were open to seeing the United States without, trying to put aside their presuppositions, and their photographs sort of allow their viewers to do the same thing. They're not telling you how to view this. The other thing that's really interesting is that there's always a lot of interchange in the photo essay between the text, which you can see surrounding the photos, and the photos themselves. So the photos operate kind of like the straight man. It's sort of feeding them the observations that they then make all kinds of jokes and asides about. So it adds to the humor, because it's just like in any good comedy duo, you need the straight man and then you need the person who plays off of him. And here the photos kind of provide those sort of humorless observations, and then they play with those observations in the captions, in the accompanying text.
And also, this is pre-Instagram. I mean,
yes.
He's trying to make a photo look beautiful. It's very documentary in form, which I think works for their purpose.
I use the word that's associated with sort of later photographers, but the idea of deadpan, that there's sort of no affect to the picture. It's just, here it is.
Right, here it is. How much do we know about average Russian citizens' response to this work over the years?
That's always, of course, the hardest thing to get at, right? How do people respond? But one thing that's clear is that their One Story America remains a point of reference for Soviet citizens who visit or end up being, forced to emigrate to the United States in the 1960s and 70s. Part of their expectations for what they're going to find in the United States are based on Ilf and Petrov's very, by that time, dated story of 1935. But it remains a kind of key point of reference for Russian people. It's the best known, I think, of all of those travel logs that were produced, partly because it's the most fun to read.
And has their work, it's been published in English. There's a book that I've seen in the United States that is a collection of their images and the text. Do you know what I'm talking about? Is that
maybe 10 years ago or something, Erica Wolf edited Anne Fisher's translation of the text of the photo essay, and
Mhm.
it includes not all, but a lot of the photographs that were in the photo essay. So it makes the photo essay available in English.
Okay. Do you recommend that?
Yeah, it's great. It's called Ilf Petrov's American Road Trip,
American
and
Road Trip.
it's an English translation of the text of the photo essays and includes images from the photo essays. And there's a brief introduction that kind of explains Ilf's interest in photography and how the trip happened. It's a thin book, but a lot of fun.
Mhm. That's good. I asked because I'm interested, but also I've noticed on these talks, a lot of our audience want to know what's a good English translation of this or that. So that's good to know. We do have a question, which you've already touched on a little bit. Did Ilf and Petrov ever have any funny misunderstandings because of language or cultural differences?
That's a great question. Um, they talk a little bit about often feeling like they don't know how to behave in the United States. They give a funny example from early in their trip. They are in an elevator, and a woman walks into the elevator, and the men in the elevator take off their hats. So they think, oh, you take off your hat when a woman enters an elevator. So a couple of days later, they're visiting their publisher, and at a big, office building in New York, and a woman gets into the elevator, and they think, oh, we're going to put our new knowledge to use, and they take off their hats, and all the other men in the elevator look at them like they're nuts, and they realize, oh, if it's a business elevator as opposed to hotel, then you don't take off your hat. So they're always, so they're kind of making fun of the New Yorkers and how they treat women differently in hotels and business situations, but they're also having a little fun at their own expense. They're really trying to figure out these crazy customs of the Americans. So a lot of things like that. They go to uh, a restaurant in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and order enchiladas. That's a place where they're completely defeated because they have no idea how spicy these things are going to be. And they describe them in sort of very culturally distinctive terms as appetizing blintzes cut with gunpowder and topped with nitroglycerin. So,
Oh,
so that's a place where they don't really know what to expect with the enchilada.
how was their experience with food in general?
They hated American food. They thought it was all it was plentiful, it looked nice, and it tasted terrible, was their basic assessment. But a lot of that is in reference to things like cafeterias and drugstores, which was kind of the American fast food of the 1930s. They also ate at a lot of places like more ethnic restaurants like the enchiladas, but also Jewish food and Chinese food and Mexican food um, that they seemed maybe to enjoy more. And then they list a lot of things that might sound good and they just don't weigh in on whether or not they tasted good. Things like barbecue sandwiches and hot dogs and pancakes and maple syrup. They just say they're all of these exotic foods and they don't say whether or not they tasted good or not.
Did they ever? Well, I know. Was it Ilf who died shortly
Yeah.
after the return? Did Petrov? Did he ever write in later reminiscences about his experience or give us more information or details about what he learned?
Well, one thing that's sort of interesting is and Petrov died actually pretty soon after too.
Yeah.
He died in a plane crash in 1942, so neither of them lived very long after their trip. Um, he in 1939 started writing an unfinished work that was a picture of the Soviet Union sort of in the 1960s, right? Sort of a science fiction. And it looks very much like the United States that they visited in 1935. So all of the things that they appreciated, like the good service and the roads and the efficiency, all of those things are part of his imagined Soviet Union of the future.
Wow. But still on Earth.
On Earth, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. Well, this has been really interesting. Thank you so much for talking to us about this book and your book. What are you working on now? What's latest?
I'm finishing with some co-authors a textbook that's a history of 20th century Russia.
Okay.
So that's the project I'm working on right now.
That's a good one.
Called
All right,
Russia's Long 20th Century.
Long, traumatic. Thank you very much for joining us. And thank you for everyone who's watching. We appreciate your support.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Great. See you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.